Hello and welcome back to the Regimentals YouTube channel. Today I am doing a tutorial all about German First World War pickelhaubes. I'm going to try and talk about them in stages. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is all the different states of the pickelhaubes. So when I say all the different states, you may have noticed that German pickelhaubes have a plate on the front of the helmet. Each plate on the front represents a different part of Germany or pre-war Germany. So we refer to them as states. The plate on the front represents the state that pickelhaube is from. And just running through the selection I have here in this back row, I'm just going to identify for you the ones that I have here. There are many, many more, but these are the traditional ones that you guys are most likely to see when you go to shows. Okay, so the first one that most people see, I would say was the most common, is the Prussian helmet plate. Now, Prussia was one of the biggest states in Germany, so it's probably the most common one you'll see. The next one we have is Saxon. It looks a little bit different. There's no eagle, it's a different shape. This is the Saxon helmet plate. Okay, and then the next one we go back to an eagle again, and this is the Baden. The state is Baden. It looks very similar to the Prussian helmet plate, but just be aware that they're two different ones. You have the Prussian one, Prussian eagle, and the Baden eagle. And then the next one we have is the Bavarian helmet plate. Again, looks a different shape. There's no eagle on this one. It's got the crown on the top, the larger, more impressive crown, and this is the Bavarian state plate. And then one of my favourites, the much more elaborate Württemberg. It has the lion and the stag. Very, very delicate. The antlers on the stag usually break, so when you're buying one of these, always make sure that the antlers on the stag's head haven't been broken and repaired. Okay, and then we move on to some of the slightly rarer ones. This one here is Hesse, a very small state. Hesse pickelhaubes tend to sell for more money than the ones that I just previously listed. Again, personally, one of my favourites is the Hesse pickelhaube. Then even rarer, this is Mecklenburg. Okay, now there's two different types of Mecklenburg, but then you're getting into minute details when you talk about Mecklenburg Strelitz or Mecklenburg Schwerin. But that's more technical, so I'm going to keep this video really for novices to give them a guideline of what they're looking at. And then of course, as I said at the start of the video, there are many, many more states. I just have two slightly rarer ones here. Saxon Weimar, a very attractive helmet plate. Looks what's interesting about it is it's like the Prussian eagle with the Saxon plate over it. It's not identical to the Saxon plate, but it's just a really interesting looking helmet plate. And then at the end I have the Oldenburg. Again, it's the Prussian eagle with a small plate, like a star-shaped plate on the front of the eagle. So those two are rarer. So what you guys will be looking out for shows mostly is those first five that I talked about: Prussian, Saxon, Baden, Bavarian and Württemberg. Okay, so before I move on to the next stage of the tutorial, I just want to mention some really important information about helmet plates. Firstly, as you'll see on this pickelhaube here, sometimes you see a Maltese cross on the centre of the helmet plate. Now all that represents that it was a reserve regiment. Okay, so don't be afraid when you suddenly see a Prussian helmet with the plate on the front, the eagle, which we identified earlier, and it has a Maltese cross. All it means it was a reserve regiment. Now, when we say reserve regiment, we don't mean that they were less important than the main guys who were fighting. Reserve regiments during World War I were just as important as the traditional main regiment. Okay, but the other important thing to talk about is how to identify when the pickelhaube plate has been replaced. Okay, so every pickelhaube plate on the reverse side, it has some lugs. Okay, these are two little prongs sticking out, and they go onto the helmet through two small holes. Okay, now when you're buying a pickelhaube, what you need to do is look on the inside of the helmet to make sure there are no extra holes. If you can see extra holes, or where extra holes have been repaired, in other words, the fibre shell of the helmet has been filled in with filler and painted over, then you can guarantee that at some point in that pickelhaube's life, it's had its helmet plate removed and a different one put on. quite often people did this to make a helmet more exciting. They would find an interesting helmet plate, they'd take off the boring Prussian helmet plate and put something more interesting in. So always be on the lookout for extra holes in the helmet shell to identify whether that helmet plate has been replaced. Okay, so moving on to the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that is I want to teach you how to identify the difference between a man's helmet, an NCO's, and an officer's. Okay, now this is quite a simple system. It's easy for me to say that, but I always have to remember that I'm trying to educate people who are new to the subject. Okay, so it's not really fair of me to say this is a simple task, because it's not. First of all, we have an enlisted man's helmet. Okay, so let's forget about what plate it is. We've identified plates already. The things to look for when you're identifying a enlisted man's pickelhaube is that it will always have a leather chin strap. Okay, always the fixings for the spike will always be domed. Okay, and then inside it will have a leather liner. Okay, that's pretty much the three basic things to look for when you're trying to identify an enlisted man's helmet. Then as we go up the levels, we look for an NCO's helmet. Okay, now this is where it gets complicated. With most NCO's helmets, we're looking for flat metal chin scales, domed rivets holding the base of the spike in place, and then quite often a silk or cloth liner inside. This is where it gets tricky, because you see differences in configuration, because sometimes you'll see stars in place holding the spike base in place, but also leather chin straps, or you'll see metal flat chin scales with a leather liner inside. So sometimes the configuration between an NCO's and an enlisted man's can change. Okay, so that is the most tricky part of this whole tutorial. But what isn't tricky is identifying an officer's helmet. An officer's helmet will always have a gilded finish, nice domed metal chin scales, the silk or cloth liner inside, and always stars holding the spike base in place. Okay, so that is quite easy to identify. Added to that, when you look at those three helmets we just looked at, you can tell the quality, especially when holding it, the quality difference between an officer's, an NCO's, and an enlisted man's. Reverting back to the helmet plates, the other thing to look for between an NCO's and a man's is the crown on the helmet plate will normally be cut out, fretted, if it's an NCO's, but on enlisted man's it will be solid. So basically they've spent less time, less money in constructing an enlisted man's helmet as they would do for an NCO's. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is the construction type of the skull of the helmet. So what is the actual helmet made out of? This is most common with enlisted man's helmets. I would say NCOs and officers, you generally, nearly always see the body of the helmet made out of leather. Okay, and obviously the first one we're going to look at is your standard leather shellacked skull. Okay, very basic. That is what most people will see. But what happened during the war is that leather became really hard for them to get hold of, and it became expensive. So they started making what we call ersatz material, and they made the pickelhaubes out of tin. Okay, so this is a metal pickelhaube made out of tin. Looks from a distance exactly the same as the leather one, but it's made out of metal. Okay, so the next construction type I want to talk about is what we call the felt helmet. Okay, now it's made of like a form of fibre, but visually, to identify it for you guys, you would look at it and you would say it's a felt helmet. Again, as I said, materials were running out, and the felt material was quite easy to obtain. and this here is a classic example of your felt covered helmet. Now, beyond those three we've just talked about, there are other types. There's a form of helmet which we call a cloth covered cork helmet, which is a helmet made out of cork with a felt covering, a cloth covering over the top. They are unusual. I think I've had 2 or 3 of those in the last 10 years. But apart from these three, the one to look out for is the cloth covered cork helmet. I think there are some of those featured in Feldzug 1914, the book that I published by Michael Baldwin. So if you want to have reference to the cloth covered cork helmet, have a look in Feldzug 1914. Okay, so we're drawing to a close now, and the next thing I wanted to talk about is the helmet plates again, the period of the helmet plates. So on these 3 helmets here, you'll notice these first 2 here, 2 Prussian, standard Prussian enlisted mans. This helmet plate here and its fittings, so the spike and the fittings that hold the chin strap in place, on this one they are made of brass, okay, and on this one they are what we call field grey. Now this is to identify that pre-war all Pickelhaubes enlisted mans were made with brass fittings, okay, and then in 1915 they sort of, it was again cutbacks. They stopped using brass and they used a more basic raw metal, and it was in field grey. It was more subdued on the battlefield. You know, they still weren't using steel helmets at this stage, but they were able to identify that a field grey coloured helmet was less identifiable to the enemy. So 2 reasons for the change. One was the use of ersatz materials, cheaper. Brass was becoming expensive, so they used a cheaper material, but also they changed the look of it to make it much more subdued to the naked eye. And then I just wanted to mention this one on the end here as well. You often see Pickelhaubes with white metal fittings, okay? Most commonly Prussian helmets with white metal fittings, and that identifies the helmet as a pioneer regiment, okay? So that's a little quirk to look out for. We have brass, we have field grey, but then white metal would identify it as a pioneer regiment. And I wouldn't necessarily say that pioneer helmets are more expensive than the regular infantry, and I really do not know why they use a different type of metal for that plate. Maybe you know, someone watching the video, you can look that up yourselves. I could easily look it up in a book, but I'm sure there must have been a reason why they used white metal. And the last thing I wanted to point out to you guys was this little fellow here. What's different about this guy? He doesn't have a spike, he has a ball. Okay, and this is pretty much common knowledge. I would say, really, me telling you this, I'm really going back to the basics of Pickelhaubes. If they have a ball top, that means it's an artillery regiment. Okay, so spikes is for infantry, ball top is for artillery. Just one last thing to say, always be aware, some of these spikes or balls are removable and some aren't. Okay, so just looking through here, I'm picking up some and they do not have removable spikes, and then obviously the later ones here, removable spike. Okay, so that's another thing to look out for. Whenever you pick up a Pickelhaube at a show, be very careful. If you're going to pick it up from the spike, okay, make sure that it's attached properly, otherwise you'll pick it up and you might drop it. So there you go, basic tutorial for beginners on German World War I Pickelhaubes. Of course, I appreciate people watching this video will already know all of this information that I've just given you, okay, but that, you know, the video is for the novice collector, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. Keep watching our website. We're trying to update as much as we can. We are in the process of changing the format of our photographs on the website, so hopefully that will be an improvement and you'll enjoy the new style of photographs we have on the website. Thank you for watching.